The sound reached me before the impact did. Not the kind of sound that travels through air. There is no air where I stand. This is the resonance of something older, something that moves through the fabric of what holds the world together. A pressure, a wrongness, like the moment before a fault line gives way, but stretched across centuries instead of seconds. I have heard that sound before. The last time, a man named Daniel was kneeling in a city of conquerors, his face pressed to a cold stone floor, his lips moving in a prayer that nobody around him could hear. 21 days he knelt. 21 days I fought to reach him. And when I finally broke through, bloodied, delayed, carrying the answer to a prayer that had already been answered before the first syllable left his mouth, I told him what I was only permitted to say in fragments, that the Prince of Persia had withstood me, that there are thrones behind thrones in this world, that what men call history is the visible residue of a war they cannot see. He trembled when I said it. He would tremble more if he could see what I am seeing now. The sky above the Zagros Mountains is not the sky you know. It never was. What you call atmosphere, that thin, fragile shell of oxygen and nitrogen that you have somehow convinced yourself separates the living from the void, is a membrane. Permeable. Contested. And tonight, if you could pull back the veil that your senses were never built to penetrate, you would see the membrane straining. You would see it lit from within by something that has no name in any human language, burning in colors that your eyes were not designed to receive. You would see, stretched across 2,000 miles of desert and mountain and ancient blood-soaked soil, a front line. And you would understand, finally, why the Middle East has never known peace. Not truly. Not the way peace was meant to exist. I am not one of the great ones. I want to be precise about that. I am not in the order of those who stand before the throne and whose faces must be covered, because even they cannot bear the full weight of what they see. I am a soldier. I have always been a soldier. My hands know the grip of a weapon the way your hands know the shape of a tool you have used since childhood. Instinctively, without thought, without hesitation. I was made for this, and I have been fighting this particular enemy since before the first Persian king drew his first breath. The Prince of Persia is not a metaphor. I need you to understand that before I go any further. Every century, in every language your scholars have used to try to contain and categorize the invisible world, there is a temptation to soften what Daniel saw, to make it allegorical, to say, of course, it simply means the spiritual atmosphere of a region, the cultural tendency toward idolatry, the systemic oppression embedded in ancient power structures. Those interpretations are not wrong, but they are dangerously incomplete. There is a being. There is a will behind it. There is a face, and I have seen that face, and I tell you that the word ancient does not begin to describe the depth of malice behind those eyes. He was ancient when Cyrus was young. He was ancient when Babel was being built. He was present when the first human hands fashioned the first human idol from the first human fear. And he leaned into that moment the way a fire leans into wind. He was not sleeping. That is the lie that has cost more than you know. The comfortable assumption, even among those who accept his existence, that he operates in seasons, that there are periods of dormancy, that certain treaties, certain generations, certain geopolitical arrangements have somehow pinned him beneath the weight of human progress. He was not sleeping, he was waiting. There is a difference that costs everything. In the years after the towers fell, I watched him work the way a master craftsman works. Patient, precise, invisible. Not in the movements of armies or the declarations of governments, though those were his instruments, in the smaller spaces, In the room where a young man sat alone with a grief that had nowhere to go and found, in that grief, the first thread of a rage that would take years to become a weapon. In the corridor of a ministry building, where a decision that would reshape a border was made not by policy, but by pride. One man's refusal to be seen as weak in front of another man, and behind that refusal, a whisper so subtle it could not be called speech. More of an inclination, a tilt of the atmosphere. That is how he moves in the age of cameras and satellites and real-time intelligence feeds. Not with fire and spectacle. The spectacular is reserved for the second heaven, where your instruments cannot reach. In the world of your seeing, he moves in the space between one thought and the next. But above Mesopotamia, above the ancient river systems that once fed the garden that was the first home of your kind, the movement is not subtle, has not been subtle for longer than your current civilization has existed. I have taken wounds there that I will not describe. What I will tell you is this. There is a geography to the second heaven that corresponds to, but does not match, the geography you navigate. The places where the membrane is thinnest, where the traffic between what is seen and unseen is most dense, are not random. They accumulate over sites of ancient covenant, ancient atrocity, ancient worship. The soil of Iraq holds the memory of Babel. The air above Iran vibrates with the frequency of Zoroastrian fire and the prayers of 1,000 years of Persian kings who offered their victories to something other than the one who gave them. And Jerusalem. I will not speak of Jerusalem at length because the weight of it is beyond what this account can hold. Only that above that city, the pressure is extraordinary, has always been extraordinary. It is the point toward which everything in this war is oriented. Every territorial dispute, every proxy conflict, every calculation made in Tehran or Riyadh or Washington or Moscow that touches on that city. Each of these is, in the unseen, a positioning of pieces on a board whose final move was written before the board was made. The Prince of Persia knows this. He has known it longer than your calendar extends. What is happening now? The sirens over Tel Aviv that your news anchors process as geopolitics. The strikes and counterstrikes that your analysts attribute to deterrence theory and regional power dynamics is not what it appears to be. That is not to say your analysts are wrong about what they see. They are describing the shadow accurately. The shadow is real. The shadow matters. People die in the shadow. Cities burn. Children grow up in the shape of what the shadow made of their fathers. But the shadow is cast by something that stands outside their instruments of measurement. I have watched him move a negotiation, not with theatrics, with patience. A word from one advisor to another. A moment of pride exploited at precisely the right instant. A historical grievance, nursed for decades, introduced into a conversation at the exact pressure point where it would collapse rather than inform. He does not need armies. He has governments. And he has time. He experiences time differently than you do. For him, a generation is not a long wait. It is barely a breath. But here is what he cannot do. And this is the thing I have returned from every engagement holding like a light that the darkness has never managed to reach. He cannot author the final movement. He can position. He can delay. He can whisper and manipulate and orchestrate suffering on a scale that would break your mind to witness directly. But the script of the last act does not belong to him. He knows this. And this knowledge, the knowledge that he is, for all his power and age and terrible intelligence, a servant of something he refuses to serve, a player in a story whose author he despises. This is the wound beneath every wound he has. It makes him more dangerous in some ways. Creatures with nothing to lose fight differently, but it means that every move he makes is at some level a move toward a conclusion he cannot prevent. I have seen the end of this war, not in detail, that is not given to me, but in the way a soldier who has studied his commander long enough begins to understand the shape of a strategy before it is fully revealed. There is a movement coming that the second heaven is not prepared for, no matter how long it has been preparing. There is a sound that will make the sound I described at the beginning of this account feel like silence. There is a moment written into the architecture of what was made when the Prince of Persia will face not a soldier like me, but the one whose name he chose to resist. And on that day, the millennia of whispered manipulation, the centuries of territorial war, the long and patient corruption of nations will collapse into nothing. Not metaphorical nothing, actual nothing. Until then, the war continues. Tonight, above the mountains, it continues. The men and women tracking radar signatures and calculating ballistic trajectories are not wrong to do what they do. The world of your seeing requires the responses of your seeing. But know this, know that the chaos has a shape, that the shape is not geopolitical, not historical, not reducible to the maps your analysts draw. Know that behind the leaders who seem to be choosing violence, there are hands older than their nations at their backs. Know that the exhaustion you feel when you look at the Middle East, that specific, ancient exhaustion of a region that seems incapable of peace, is not a cultural failure or a civilizational flaw. It is a symptom. The disease is older than civilization, and the cure has already been administered. The question is only whether you will live inside that knowledge or outside it, in the space where the Prince of Persia still has room to work. I am returning to the front. The sound is changing. Something is moving in the layers above Mesopotamia that requires every soldier we have. I cannot tell you how this particular engagement ends. I cannot tell you how many more there will be before the last one. What I can tell you, what I carry back from every encounter, battered and certain, is that the one who sent me has not abandoned this watch, has never abandoned it, has not looked away from the burning map of the Middle East for even the fraction of a moment that would give the Prince of Persia the uncontested ground he has spent millennia trying to claim. He is still holding it, and that changes everything. Even here, even now, especially now. The battle is not over, but the battle is not lost. And there is a difference between those two truths that is worth more than you know. Go back to your world of sirens and headlines and impossible distances. I am going back to mine. We will hold the line. This is a work of Christian inspirational fiction, rooted in biblical theology and prophetic literature, including the Book of Daniel. The narrative takes creative and speculative liberties with angelic warfare, territorial spirits, and eschatological events for the purpose of spiritual reflection and storytelling. All images and videos were generated using artificial intelligence to illustrate and dramatize these themes. This content is intended for edification and is not a doctrinal statement.